Well, I think it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that we live in a world that is self-obsessed and self-absorbed. And increasingly so as the days go. And for many of us, we are appalled at the showings of self-obsession and selfishness in our world. But to others of us, we've seen it all too often. And social media can bring this out all the more. There's literally a word that we have in our culture for taking pictures of ourselves. It's called a selfie. Right? It's a selfie. There's selfie sticks that we make so that we, wherever we are, can take pictures of ourselves. It's one thing to travel. It's another thing to have your selfie stick handy with your phone. So, hey, wow, the Eiffel Tower is awesome. But you know what would make this picture much better? Me. And so what do? Right? We do this all the time, right? Cleo and I were astonished when we went to the UK a couple of years ago, and we saw and this is, talk about an international city. People from all over the world visit London, just like they do New York and many of the big cities in the world. And we were shocked at how many selfie sticks there were. Like, it's an epidemic. But the finding that right pose, getting the right angle, like there's people that are essentially, I'm not going to knock on Kim Kardashian, but she's kind of set a culture of self-obsession in pictures. But it's quite a vicious circle, a vicious cycle for us that we can become and be as self-obsessed as anybody. And it's really contagious if you think about it. Simon Sinek, in his book Leaders Eat Last, he made the observation, particularly at the workplace. He says, the less our colleagues and leaders look out for us, the less we look out for them. The less we look out for them, the more selfish they become. And as a result, the more selfish we become. And when that happens, eventually, everyone loses. And it can be like a virus when we see selfishness and self-obsession attack us. It can actually make us want to be far more selfish and self-obsessed. And this is the norm of our world. This is the world we live in. And Time Magazine, every 15 to 20 years, posts some sort of a magazine cover with a picture of the current youth generation and how self-obsessed they are. And Time Magazine has been running an article or running a magazine cover like this since the 20s. That each generation is selfish or obsessed with themselves. It was said, believe it or not, those in the greatest generation, the World War II generation, were looked at by their parents and the World War I generation as spoiled and selfish. and the greatest generation looked at the baby boomers as obsessed with themselves and entitled, right? And then they turn around and they look at Gen Xers and millennials as self-obsessed and selfish. And it all the more, the world that we live in makes what Jesus has done and who Jesus is look all the more radical, in my estimation. Since the norm of our world is selfishness, the gospel of Jesus Christ actually seems very, very strange and otherworldly. And David Wells, one of my professors, had a great definition of worldliness. Worldliness is a way of thinking that makes holiness and godliness look strange. and I think we can succumb to that worldliness. But hear these words from Romans chapter 5 that the Apostle Paul wrote to us. He said, "For one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one would dare even to die. But God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Since therefore we have been justified by his blood, much more shall we be saved by him from the wrath of God. For if while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his Son, much more now that we are reconciled, shall we be saved by his life. In the midst of our selfish world, the Apostle Paul says, one will scarcely die for a righteous person or a good person. And it's not to say that people don't sacrifice themselves for each other. They do. Happens, we see this in the military all the time. We see this in families all the time with parents for kids. And these things do happen. But they're isolated incidents, so much so that we herald those people as heroes. And that's for people that we love or are good people or we see some sort of a value in them. And the astounding thing of the gospel, the astounding truth, is that God shows his love for us in dying for us as sinners. Those who, we hate him by nature. We're opposed to him in his way of thinking. And we ourselves have succumbed to selfishness. And it's this epidemic. And here we have God stepping in and going, regardless of how I'm hated, and regardless of how unrighteous humanity is, I'm going to give my life for them. I'm going to give my life for them. I love the way Paul Tripp talks about the gospel. He says, the gospel is God's willing self-sacrifice for our redemptive good that does not require our reciprocation or that we be deserving. It's a staggering grace of the gospel. It doesn't demand that we love him the way he loves us, and it doesn't demand that we be deserving. And that's what grace is, right? Getting something good when you deserve something bad. And this morning, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the first prediction in the Mark's gospel that Jesus makes about his own sacrifice. And what we want to do is we're going to key on the response to this as he tells his disciples. And what we want to do is we want to look at essentially this big idea about self-sacrifice. Jesus came to normalize self-sacrifice in God's people. Jesus came to normalize self-sacrifice in God's people. In other words, Jesus came to change the way we think. He came to change who we are. And he's come to actually make self-sacrifice not be something that's just out of the ordinary or otherworldly, but something that is the way in which God's people are, the way we function, selfless and actually servants. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at first God's self-sacrifice for us, and then we're going to look at our self-sacrifice for him. So first, let's look at God's self-sacrifice. If you have a copy of your scriptures, or we have it up here on the screen, Mark chapter 8, verse 27. And I'm going to let you stay seated, and we're going to read this together, okay? Starting at verse 27. And Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they told him, "John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets." And he asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Christ." And he strictly charged them to tell no one about him. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed. After 3 days, rise again. Woof. Woof. Wow. That escalated quickly, right? In the text, right? We have here quite an unusual place for Jesus to lead his disciples. Does anybody know where Caesarea Philippi is? Some of you do. I know you guys do. Does anybody know where Caesarea Philippi is? Go ahead. Yeah, Lee. The Gentile side, right? Okay. North, south, east, west?
It would be on the east side of the Sea of Galilee.
East side. Okay. And anything else? You guys know. North. That's right. It's north. It's up north. Jesus is on his way to take them, right, in kind of a secluding way off the map, off the map of Israel, and takes them into Gentile territory. And he actually takes them to Caesarea Philippi. Does anybody know what Caesarea Philippi is famous for? Yes, Rob.
Worshipping the goddess Pan.
God, Pan. That's correct. That's correct. So as you think about it, right, Caesarea Philippi is way, way, way up here, right? Galilee's down here, and then Caesarea Philippi is way up north. And Caesarea Philippi was a center of worship for the god Pan. And there weren't a lot of temples to Pan. Does anybody know anything about the god Pan in the Greek pantheon? Anybody know? Yeah, go ahead.
He was like the nature god.
That's right, god of nature. That's right. And what kind of a form did he take? A satyr. What's a satyr? That could mean different thing. If you're Jewish, a seder is different. But the pronunciation here, yeah, go ahead.
A goat man.
A goat man, essentially, right?
From Narnia.
Right. Or a centaur, and some people would say, right? So normally, Pan is envisioned as kind of a half goat, half man. Kind of like this, right? And there's a lot of stories in Greek mythology about him playing the flute, and he's a very promiscuous person, but he's associated with flocks and shepherds and nature in the wild, and they didn't actually have many temples to him because he was kind of like considered part of nature or kind of a god of nature. And so there were actually edifices that were all over the place that were dedicated to Pan. And one of those edifices is found in Caesarea Philippi. So it's an odd place to take your disciples. You would bring them where? To the center of Pan worship. Kind of a weird thing, right? Now, what's interesting is that this becomes a backdrop for Jesus to ask two very important questions. Jesus asked the disciples two questions which seem to both distinguish who he is, and not only that, distinguish who they are. And the first kind of question is what? Who do people say that I am? Who do people say that I am? And this is a question that it really is asked throughout the whole gospel. The question is, who is Jesus? Who is he? Who is this miracle worker? Who is this person who's casting out demons? Who's this person who's raising people from the dead? Who's this person who is teaching and preaching like this? And we remember in Mark chapter 6, right, when Jesus goes to Nazareth and he goes to his hometown, right? He goes to the synagogue there, and they're like, who is this guy? And they're like, he's got to be a prophet of some kind. And then who else kind of asked this question in Mark chapter 6? Does anybody remember? Who asked that question? John? Who said that? You did. Okay. John? Okay. John who? John the Baptist. Okay, now did he ask that question? No, actually it was Herod, right? Herod's asking that question. Who is this, right? And the common answer from people is he's got to be some kind of prophet. Whether it's John the Baptist raised from the dead or maybe Elijah from the Old Testament, right? And so here it is. This is the common answer. People can't pinpoint who he is, but they know he's special. They know he's got a voice. And so what's Peter say? What does Peter say? He says what? Go ahead, say it. Go ahead. You are the Christ. You are the Christ. Now, what does it mean to be the Christ? The Messiah. Okay? And what does the word Messiah mean? Anointed one, right? Mashiach in the Hebrew, right? It's anointed one. And this is essentially the promised king of the Old Testament. The promised descendant of David who's going to be baptized with the Spirit, right? And so this is a huge confession for Peter to make here, right? A big, huge confession. And then this confession is followed by what? A great denial, right? Jesus here says, okay, now that you know who I am, let's ask the question, do you actually know who I really am? Because people fill in, when they think of the word Messiah, they fill in a certain type of identification. And in the Old Testament, people think Davidic king. They think the descendant of David who's going to rule and reign over the earth. And as the king of Israel, his kingdom is going to expand to include all the kingdoms of the earth. He's going to be the king of kings. But that's incomplete with the fullness of the identity. Jesus wants them to understand that the identity of the Messiah has been going over people's heads, that they're not really reading all of the Old Testament. And so what he's saying is that the Son of Man, who is just another name for the Messiah, right, from Daniel chapter 7, must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed. Now, here's what's interesting about this, is that we start to see another kind of layer about why he picked this location. Does anybody know anything about one of the unique things about the god Pan in Greek mythology? Lee, Mr. Smarty Pants over there. What you got?
No, I was smacking at a fly.
Okay, so Pan, does anybody know specifically what's unique about Pan as a god in the Greek pantheon? And if you do, wow, you get bonus points. I got gold stars for you, because most people don't. Okay, of all of the gods in the Greek pantheon, he's one of the only ones ever to die. Matter of fact, Herodotus, Plutarch, one of the writers, the Greek writers of mythologies, has essentially coined the statement, the great god Pan is dead. So here it is. He's using this location to say, like, I am going to die. I am going to suffer. I am going to be judged. And he's using, like, in a Gentile context, one of the most identifiable gods who dies. It's incredible. It's incredible. And yet, what Jesus wants them to know is that he is not just the Son of Man, but he's also the suffering servant. Remember, we've talked about this in resetting our expectations. Isaiah 53. Jesus is putting this to the forefront and saying, this is who I am. This is what it means to be the Messiah. It's not just the Son of Man, but also the suffering servant. And in Isaiah 53, just a part of what's here in Isaiah 53 says, he was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace. And with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. And so he's getting very specific about what this is going to look like for him. And what it looks like for him is that he himself is going to be rejected. He himself is going to be killed. And yet he himself is going to be, unlike Pan, is going to be resurrected. And this is the good news. This is the gospel. This is how it's accomplished. How is the forgiveness of sins accomplished? Somebody has to die. Just like the picture of sacrifice from all the Old Testament, all the way forward, is painted, right? Blood offering after blood, or sacrifice after sacrifice, right? Going all the way back to Isaac and the substitute that was provided for him, right? And then the Passover, right? And then the whole sacrificial system, right? All the sacrifices everywhere, and it's all pointing to God himself suffering in our place. This is his self-sacrifice. But his self-sacrifice is not in isolation, right? It actually does something. It actually accomplishes something. And what that does is it helps us understand our self-sacrifice, right? In verse 32, we see the response to this prediction that Peter has. And well, let's read it together here. And he said this plainly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." So a moment after Peter's great confession, "You are the Christ." And Matthew would tell us that Jesus was delighted with that response and says, "Flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven," right? And here, the next moment, he goes to a great denial. And if that doesn't encourage you as a disciple, that we ourselves are total messes when it comes to God's grace here, right? On the one hand, we can have some great realizations, and on the other hand, we can have some great moments of just putting our foot in our mouths. And this is exactly what happens, is that Peter takes Jesus aside and begins to rebuke him. Now, would anybody care to speculate what he rebuked him about? What do you think he rebuked him for? Go ahead, Rob. Yeah.
Prophesying his own death.
And so why would he rebuke him for that?
Because, do you want me to go?
Go ahead, yeah.
There was a thought in the day of the Messiah being this military leader that was going to overthrow Rome, and Jesus can't do that if he's going to die.
Hard to do that, right? Hard to conquer Rome if you're dead, right? And if you're going to be rejected by the elders and you're going to be killed, and let's let that resurrection thing just fly over his head here, right? How is that good for anything? How's that? What is this really going to accomplish? What are we in this for here, right? And I would love to know. Wouldn't you love to have been in that conversation? He sets Jesus aside and he's like, "What's your problem?" Yeah, Rob, go ahead.
I just realized,
Yeah.
there's probably a whole other issue. If he's going to be rejected by the chief priest, like he's saying, Peter's probably worried about having some egg on his face because there's going to be this massive public perception of Jesus being a heretic, a blasphemer, and this is his students, you know.
And now the plot thickens, doesn't it, right? Now we start to get to the real reason why he's rebuking Jesus. Why is he rebuking Jesus? Is it because, "Oh, Lord, please, we can't have that happen to you. You're so precious. We don't want you to suffer. How could that happen to you? You're amazing." That's not the dynamic that's here. Peter has selfish reasons for rebuking Jesus. And this comes out in Jesus' response, doesn't it? Whoa, right? Jesus gets charged up by this. "Get behind me, Satan." Now, where are they? They're in Caesarea Philippi, right? It's the center of pan worship. Now, did you realize that there's some similarities between the perceptions of Satan, his attributes in his story, as there are with Pan? As a matter of fact, people who actually had cult worship around Satan, they worshiped him as a half goat, half man. It's really interesting, isn't it? And what's interesting is that this very edifice to Pan could have been right behind where they were. So there's a lot of meaning that's happening here. He could very well be saying "No, dude, what are you What are you talking about? Get behind me. You're thinking just like the pagans are, right? You're thinking just like Satan is, the accuser. You don't have the things of God in mind here. And Peter's putting two and two together. I think Rob's exactly right here. If he's going to suffer and he's going to be rejected, what is that going to mean for us? Does this mean that we're going to suffer? Does this mean that we're going to be rejected? And the answer is absolutely. Because when you identify with Jesus as the Messiah, He's your Lord. And whoever your Lord is, and whoever his identity is, that now gets connected to you. And so essentially what Jesus is doing is calling out Peter just like he called out Satan in the wilderness, right? The way you're thinking is not the way of God. Matter of fact, Jesus continues, right? He continues from here. And he's like, you're only concerned about your well-being. So guess what? I don't want my disciples to get the impression that anything that Peter is saying is right. So let's stand and let's read this together here. Let's stand and read this together. And now we have the call of Jesus to his disciples like us. In calling the crowd to him with his disciples, he said to them, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life would lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? For what can a man give in return for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. You may be seated. Thank you. So Jesus, what does he do? He seizes the moment. He seizes this moment and goes, this is the perfect teaching opportunity, the perfect teaching moment for our disciples. And what he wants to do is he wants to share with his disciples the cruciform vision for following Jesus. To be cruciform means to be shaped by the cross. And this is the vision he's casting for his disciples of everyday self-denial, of everyday self-sacrifice, of everyday service to others. And his vision here is essentially he's coming to normalize self-sacrifice. And so what he does here, and he gives reasons for this. He gives these glorious reasons with this penetrating logic. I love the logic of Jesus. It's so gorgeous. And so every time you see 4 in verse 35, 4 in verse 36, 4 in verse 37, 4 in verse 38, he's giving us reasons why this is a no-brainer. And reasons why this is really the true way to think, the only way to think. And simultaneously, what he does in these reasons from verse 35 to 38, simultaneously, he helps us understand our need for the gospel, and then he helps us to see the provision of the gospel that corresponds to this, right? So our need for the gospel, right? We see this in verse 35. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. Essentially, he's saying we can't save our lives. We're aging, right? This flesh, this skin's getting older, right? And some of us get frightened by the growth of our bodies and where it's leading us. But guess where it's leading us, guys? It's leading us to the grave. And there's nothing you can do to save your life. There's nothing you can do. And we all have the sentence of death upon us. And what he's offering us is resurrection and eternal life. This is what he's accomplishing with the gospel. That our bodies would be better than ever. That we would have life that's extended forever, indefinitely, with him and in his presence. So it's a no-brainer. It's like, what are you going to do? You can't save your own life. And this is essentially the project of selfishness and self-absorption. Is about self-preservation, is really what he's getting at, right? And he says, for what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? What can a man give in return for his soul? And so here he says, we can't give ourselves for the world. Another way of saying is that we want everything. We want our kingdoms. And there's nothing, in exchanging our soul, there's nothing we can actually do in order to get that right exchange. Even if we gave up and forfeited ourselves, we could never inherit or gain the world and all that the world possesses, right? And I think of this as all the provisions that we need, all the needs that we have, and then some. And he's saying he actually gave himself so that he could give us the world. He's actually giving us the inheritance. He's giving us eternal life. And with that, what's he doing? He's giving us the new Jerusalem, the new heavens and new earth. A realm and a place that's perfect and selfless. And that's exactly what he's giving his life for. And in verse 37, he says, verse 38, for whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. And what's he saying is that we deserve the shame of judgment. We deserve it. We deserve to be shamed. We deserve for the books to be opened and for our inner monologue forever to be read. Right? And what's he saying? Jesus is willing to take the shame for us. Taking all of our judgment. All of that's what he's offering us. And this is the reasoning, this is the gospel logic which leads to his vision of our own self-sacrifice. I love the way Jim Elliot put it. He said, he is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. You follow that? He is no fool. In other words, you're not a fool. He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep, right? In other words, sacrifices some things that you can't actually have and keep in order to gain what you cannot lose. And this is the unfairness of the gospel exchange. Wait, Jesus gives his life and we get all of the benefits? Right? Yes. So that means that we can actually, we're freed so that we can actually give up everything for him. Giving up our own glory on this earth. Giving up even maybe our own lives on this earth. Because his self-sacrifice provides for all of our needs and satisfies every longing in our hearts, we are empowered for lives of service for each other. And you don't have to be a Christian to know the benefits of selflessness. It doesn't take any grace to see how actually things are better. One non-Christian author, his name is Daniel Goleman, he says in his book, Social Intelligence, he says, self-absorption in all of its forms kills empathy, let alone compassion. When we focus on ourselves, our world contracts as our problems and preoccupations loom large. But when we focus on others, our world expands. Our own problems drift to the periphery of the mind and so seem smaller. And we increase our capacity for connection or compassion in action. It doesn't take grace to see that when we focus on others, when we actually give ourselves for others, it broadens our horizons, it broadens our perspective. because we see that the world's not limited to our own little problems. And what's happening here is that Jesus is showing us that his whole way of thinking is that way. So much so it's going to take him to the cross. And he reorients the way we see ourselves, the way we can see ourselves. We are not entitled princes, but we are humbled servants of our suffering Messiah. And denying ourselves and taking our cross, it starts with something as simple as we heard Ed praying for earlier. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Right? That's a form of self-denial. Yes. It's to bow the knee, bend the knee to our Lord. And to say, it's your kingdom, it's your way. And we actually look to him for our marching orders because we're his servants. And it also continues. It may begin with prayer, but it continues in our own homes. It continues as we seek to serve the loved ones that we lived with. And the roommates that we have, the parents that we have, the children that we have. And what this looks like is every day making choices and decisions that I care more about others than I do for myself. They're more important to me. Everyone else around me is a priority, right? And because of that, you know what? It means we find ways to serve each other. So guess what? That means we're going to do the dishes. We're going to do the laundry. We're going to shovel. Which I hate.
Me too.
Or snow blow, right? Or rake, or mow, or how about do the dishes? Right? How about cooking? Right? These are all tangible ways that we serve each other. And it's hard, right? As we hear all the time, familiarity can breed contempt. But ought not that to be. It should actually build empathy and sympathy, love, and care. And that's just in the home what self-denial looks like. When we actually wake up and go, you know what, my spouse, man, I love her, right? I want to do whatever I can to help her, whatever I can. Ah, man, my kids, man, what can I do to bless them today? And not look at them as either my servants or just they're just in my way, right? And this continues, right? When we go to work, we bring this to work. What does self-denial look at work? Oh, man, you know what it looks like? It looks like I'm going to be the best teammate that I can be here at work. Man, I'm going to serve everyone around me. Man, I cannot wait to find ways to bless people. Man, I want to do my work with energy, with joy. And I'm not going to be the one who's sitting here complaining about the boss or complaining about our teacher if we're at school. Because that's typically what we tend to do, is complain rather than serve joyfully in love. And Jesus later, he's going to, in the next couple of chapters, he's going to try to upend the way the disciples think about leadership. And I think this impacts us as not only just church leaders, as elders and deacons, but it impacts us as parents, right? And if you own a business, if you have employees. He says in Mark 10, Jesus called them to him and said to them, you know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. It's just the kind of parenting that you have. It's the kind of leadership that you have. Right? And really, the resounding question of self-denial, and it can sometimes be a pride-swallowing siege, as Jerry Maguire says. is we ask the question of everyone around us, how can I serve you? How can I serve you? The Apostle Paul reminded us that we don't serve people in order to manipulate them. Right? It's easy to do that. It's easy to flatter people. Easy to hey, Mom, yeah, I'll do this. And on the back end, you're hoping, yeah, but I really want this. And this is just a works kind of exchange. I do this, so you give me this. And the Apostle Paul says, no. That's not the way it works. He says in 2 Corinthians 5, he said it this way. He said, for the love of Christ controls us or constrains us, right? Because we have concluded this, that one has died for all, therefore all have died. And he died for all, that those who live might no longer live for themselves, but for him who for their sake died and was raised. Jesus came to crush sin, and selfishness really is at the core of all sin. And this is what he's come to do, to give us his love so we can say, how can I serve? How can I help? And we value this at Cornerstone so tremendously. Our four key identities. We are worshipers, we are family, right? We're missionaries, and we're servants. And so this is what Jesus wants to do. He wants to normalize this among us. So two questions as we depart. The first one is this: do you see Jesus as your suffering servant? Do you see Jesus as your suffering servant? And if you do, then the next question follows this. Do you see yourself as his servant for others? Why? Because Jesus came to normalize self-sacrifice through his own self-sacrifice for us. So we're going to pray, ask the Lord's help.